praying for grace to understand. Spirit of Jesus, open our hearts to live and to love the gospel of the Lord.
Heart to Heart, a Catholic media ministry, presents an inspiring gospel reflection by Father Michael Sparrow. Father Michael is a Jesuit priest working as a writer and retreat master at the Bellarmine Jesuit Retreat House outside Chicago.
The Lord be with you. A reading from the Holy Gospel according to Luke. As Jesus continued his journey to Jerusalem, he traveled through Samaria and Galilee. And as he was entering a village, 10 lepers met him. They stood at a distance from him and raised their voice, saying, "Jesus, Master, have pity on us." And when he saw them, he said, "Go, show yourselves to the priests." And as they were going, they were cleansed. And one of them, realizing he had been healed, returned, glorifying God in a loud voice. And he fell at the feet of Jesus and thanked him. He was a Samaritan. Jesus said in reply, 10 were healed, were they not? Where are the other 9? Has none but this foreigner returned to give thanks to God? Then he said to him, "Stand up and go your way. Your faith has saved you." The Gospel of the Lord. In this month of November, we're especially called to gratitude, and there's no better gospel to embody that than this familiar story of the healing of the 10 lepers. The lepers, of course, were socially ostracized because the disease was highly contagious, and so they had to keep themselves at a distance and shout out to those who were coming, "Unclean and unclean." But when they saw Jesus, they knew of his reputation as a great healer, and so they call out at a distance, "Jesus, have pity on us." Jesus doesn't hesitate instantaneously. He says, "Go show yourselves to the priests." That would be the validation that they would need to be able to officially enter back into society. And of course, on the way, as the story goes, they were cleansed. What's significant, and what I invite us to reflect on today, is that only one of the 10 returned to Jesus to say thank you. It's so easy to miss that attitude of gratitude. And yet, when we live from that perspective of grateful for what we have, it changes everything. St. Mother Teresa once wrote, "The best way for me to show my gratitude to God is to accept everything, even my problems, with joy." When that's our attitude, that whatever comes into my life, I want to be able to accept this, it changes our perspective, and we're no longer looking at what we don't have. We're grateful for what we do have. The great German mystic Meister Eckhart wrote, "If the only prayer you said was thank you, that would be enough. If the only prayer you ever said was thank you, that would be enough." Many of you know that we have a new Jesuit who has joined the Jesuit community at Bellarmine, Father Jim Struck. He lived as a missionary over in East Africa for over 34 years. And I just delight in watching his perspective as he moves through America, having lived in Africa for 34 years. He constantly remarks on the abundance that we have here. We never, just walking into a food store or walking into a Walmart, the abundance of choices that we have is so different from what he's lived with for 34 years. He said, I've never lived in such plush circumstances in my entire life. Well, those of us that have been living here in America for our whole lives or most of our lives, we just kind of take it for granted. But does the abundance of things make us happier? That's part of his further reflection, that so often living among these people that have meager means, they're as happy, if not more happy, for what they have. Father Struck also lived among the Native Americans out in the Dakotas for many years. There's a Native American saying that goes, "Give thanks for unknown blessings already on their way." Give thanks for unknown blessings already on their way. If that's our perspective, that God is always blessing us, God always wants what's best for us, then whatever happens to us in the course of the day is seen as an opportunity to draw closer to the Lord. The American poet Mary Oliver expresses this beautifully in one of her poems. She writes, "Someone I loved once gave me a box full of darkness. It took me years to understand that this too was a gift." Someone I loved once gave me a box full of darkness. It took me years to understand that this too was a gift. When we live our lives from the perspective that God is always blessing us, God is always drawing us closer to to himself, it changes our perspective. People who are grateful are people who are happy. Gratitude in our heart increases our happiness. I was listening recently to a reflection by Dr. Tim from Formed, and a discipline he suggested is that we take time every day to write down 10 things that we're grateful for. He humorously observed, it's a way of paying it forward. In today's gospel, there are the 10 lepers. 9 of them are not grateful. Only 1 returns to say thanks. Let's play it forward for the people around us who are not grateful. That, sadly, it's probably true that 90% of the people in society today don't live with a perspective of gratitude. So let's make up for that 90% by reflecting on and actually writing down or saying out loud or consciously being aware of the many, many blessings we have. St. Ignatius Loyola once wrote, "The greatest of sins is not to be grateful for what we have." The greatest of sins is not to be grateful for what we have. Cicero said, gratitude is not only the greatest of all virtues, but the parent of all others. When we're grateful, it increases our awareness of God's blessing. When we're not grateful, what happens, and I think this is St. Ignatius's point, we spiral into an attitude of taking the blessings for granted and grumbling about what we don't have. Albert Einstein once said, "There are only 2 ways to live our life. One is if nothing is a miracle, the other is if everything is a miracle." Isn't that the truth? To be able to look at our lives and to see God's grace unfolding and to recognize that this is a power so much greater than ourselves. President Kennedy once said, "As we express our gratitude, we must never forget that the highest appreciation is not to utter words of thanks, but to live by them." Not just to say thank you, but to live daily with that attitude of gratitude in our hearts. The saints are those who have learned to be grateful for whatever unfolds in their life, because God makes all things work to the good for those who love him. It's probably my favorite phrase in St. Paul, Romans 8, chapter 8, verse 28. God makes all things work to the good for those who love him. The same exact thing can happen to two different people, and one person is absolutely devastated as a result of that experience. They curse God and they live with anger in their hearts. And the exact same thing happens to someone else, and they change their attitude and they grow into great holiness. A powerful example of that is Mother Seton, first canonized native-born American saint. Mother Seton lived in wealth and privilege, and she married a very successful businessman. But when his business failed and then his health failed and he died and she was left stricken with poverty with a boatload of kids, she didn't despair in the midst of that, but she leaned in closer to God, and the result was she continued to grow in holiness. She didn't focus simply on what she had lost. She looked around in others, and she saw many others in much greater need than she, and the result was she formed a religious order. She reached out to the poor, she reached out to orphans, she reached out to the sick. And she's remembered as this great saint, the first American saint. The same set of circumstances can happen to two different people. I lost my money. I lost my bank account. I lost my husband. What do I have to live for? Or we can say, even in these circumstances, God is drawing me closer to himself. Let me end with sharing one of my favorite stories. It's a story that I've literally told hundreds of times and expresses the truth that it's not what we have, it's how we appreciate what we have that makes a difference. It's a Japanese folk fable entitled Ishikari, or the Stonecutter. Once upon a time, there lived a stonecutter who went every day to the great rock on the side of the mountain to cut out slabs. He was quite happy and content. Now, in the mountain there lived a spirit which sometimes appeared to people and helped them become rich and prosperous. The stonecutter had never seen this spirit and only shook his head with an unbelieving air whenever anybody talked about it. Well, one day the stonecutter carried a gravestone to the house of a very rich man. He saw there all sorts of beautiful things of which he had never even dreamed. Suddenly, his daily work seemed to grow harder and heavier, and he said to himself, "Oh, if only I were a rich person and could sleep in a bed with silken curtains and golden tassels, how happy I would be." And a voice answered, "Your wish is heard. A rich man you shall be." He thought it was just his imagination, so he demanded his wages and went home. But when he reached home, he discovered that his humble hut had turned into a magnificent palace. Oh, he was nearly beside himself with joy, and in his new life, the old one was soon forgotten. Well, one day the rich man was out watering his lawn when the rays of the sun scorched his face. His face grew drier and hotter, and the flowers seemed to wilt before his eyes. And he said, "Oh, if only I were the sun and mightier than any." And the voice answered, "Your wish is heard. The sun you shall be." And the sun he was. Oh, he shot his beams above and below the earth. He burnt up the grass in the fields and scorched the faces of young and old, rich and poor, priests and nuns. No one escaped the power of the sun. This is better than all, he said to himself. But then one day a cloud covered his face and hid the earth from him. He cried out, "Oh, is this cloud mightier than the sun? Oh, if only I were a cloud and mightier than any. And a voice answered, your wish is heard. A cloud you shall be. And a cloud he was. Oh, he caught the sun's beams and held them. And to his joy, the earth grew green again, and flowers blossomed. For days and weeks he poured forth rain. Towns and villages were destroyed by the power of the rain. Ha ha! This is better than all, he said to himself. Only the great rock on the side of the mountain remained unmoved. Is a rock mightier than a cloud? Oh, if only I were a rock and mightier than any. And a voice answered, your wish is heard. The rock you shall be. And the rock he was. Proudly he stood, and neither the heat of the sun nor the force of the rain could move him. This is better than all, he said to himself. But then one day he heard a strange noise at his feet. And when he looked down, he saw a stone cutter driving tools into his surface. Even as he looked, a great block broke off and fell upon the ground. He cried out, is this mere child of earth mightier than a rock? Oh, if only I were human. And a voice answered, your wish is heard. A human being you shall be. And a human he was. Once again he toiled at his trade of stone cutting. His bed was hard and his food was scanty, but he'd learned to be satisfied with it. And he no longer desired to be something or somebody else. He lived with a grateful heart. Amen? Amen.
Heart to heart, hand in hand, praying for grace to understand. Spirit of Jesus, open our hearts to live and to love the gospel